I don't think she ran a particularly bad campaign. I think her campaign was way better than Hillary 2016. I think Trump's campaign was way worse than Trump 2016. I think she was trying on some economic issues to be genuinely progressive and populist. $6,000 child tax credit as an example, picking Tim Walz, who did free school breakfast and lunch for kids. Also trying to say to Republicans, hey, I'm not crazy, I'm not far left just because I'm a black woman. I disagree with the bear hug strategy of Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney, which is the way she tried to do that. But the idea of saying to Republicans, like, hey, you're welcome, I don't disagree with that, especially because she was hawking some genuinely progressive policies. So here's my theory as to what happened. I'm curious for your reaction, and I'm curious for your reaction, Crystal. So the first problem is I really don't think people should understate how much of an anti-incumbency election this was. And there's not much you could do about that other than like rewind time and have Bernie win in 2016 and have him really address people's material conditions so that gives the Democrats like dominance moving forward. So the general problem was anti-incumbent election. But then I do think the Democrats have sort of a stylistic problem in today's day and age. Democrats like running polished and professional politicians. And this is not the era of polished professional politicians. It's just not. That era died after Barack Obama. This is the era of the raw and unfiltered and authentic feeling politician. There was also an overarching problem, which is Republicans have a narrative. I hate their narrative, but they have a narrative, and they connect their policies to that narrative. I hate their policies. I think Americans should hate their policies, but their narrative is immigrants are the problem. They're the reason your life sucks. Elite liberals and Hollywood, they're the problem. They're the reason your life sucks. Minorities are the problems. Blame them. Blame them. The Democrats don't have a counter narrative. They're just technocrats. That even if Kamala has good policies, if she just hands you the list of her policies and says, this is what I support, that doesn't land. You have to connect it to a broader narrative. And again, Bernie was much better at that, where, you know, the narrative was the problem is elite Republicans and big donor corruption. That's the problem. Big money in politics, the government's representing the corporations and the billionaires, not representing you. And Democrats just totally abandoned the idea of having a narrative and being the protagonist in their own story, like Trump is the protagonist in his own story. And then finally, the two other things is we do have a media problem. Our information environment is shit. If you look at the top podcasts, they're all right-leaning podcasts, and right-wingers have set up this colossal echo chamber online, particularly for young men. And that sort of was reflected in this election. You saw that Trump sort of chipped away at all these different demographic groups that you wouldn't expect him to chip away on. And it's because if a kid gets interested in working out or has some other hobby or self-improvement or whatever, they go online and it's nothing but right-wing coded shows. And I think that genuinely hurt. And then the final point I'd make, and this is the one I feel like everybody is missing. Everybody's saying, and I agree with this to some extent, everybody's saying, look, you got to be more bold on your policy stuff. You have to be for more universal programs. You have to go to the left. And in the same way Republicans throw red meat to their base, you need to throw red meat to the Democratic base. I totally agree with that. But I also think the missing part is let's not ignore that Trump is a controversial, charismatic celebrity. And just those things about him, I think, probably turned out a lot of people who wouldn't have voted otherwise to go vote for him. And on the Democratic side, my point is, even if you flipped the ticket and had Tim Walz at the top of the ticket, and Tim Walz has phenomenal policies, I still think Trump would have won. And so it's not just, here's my policy list. It's connecting it to a narrative, but then also having the right spokesperson for it. So that's why I've been going around now saying Jon Stewart 2028, because he's a controversial, charismatic celebrity. So anyway, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Trump, like what you said about Trump and his own strengths, I think that is a large part of the story. And it's interesting because like you're talking about the right-wing echo chamber, it goes against with what a lot of the right had been saying for years about Trump. A lot of the people who are like his biggest people, like Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro, really hated him in 2016 in the primary. They said they wouldn't vote for him, largely because they thought he wasn't a real conservative. And that was, a lot of people did see him that way in 2016 because like you said, his personality is what's the predominant thing. He was seen as the most moderate Republican candidate in decades. A lot of that was Hillary not connecting him with the more extreme elements of his party and trying to actually disconnect him from the rest of the party as a whole, even though the Republicans themselves were not quite popular. During his presidency, he runs basically a Bush administration 2.0 kind of like thing. He like loses a lot of support. People like his worst moments often come when he does the most traditionally conservative stuff. He starts to be regarded as a lot more conservative, and he loses like in 2024. Like because he lost like either like didn't make gains that he was expected to make, or he lost ground among a lot of these like this was a bit marginal because 2020 was a marginal election. He loses support both like among suburbanites who just don't really like what he represents, but fails to really make gains with these kind of working class people. I think Biden actually is the only like group the only group Trump loses total like vote share with is white men. So like his embracing of the like this like social conservatism, like that kind of larger like ideology does not really do him any favors. Over 2020 and over the Biden's administration, you have Republicans running even further to the right while he's out of power, and you have a lot of moments where Trump actually like ends up being not to the left, but kind of like a bit more of a centrist member of his party. He blames them after 2022 for not like being like having acceptable messaging on abortion. He goes after like Charlie Kirk, I think at the beginning of this year, when Kirk was trying to like do some like movement to cancel MLK, like Martin Luther King. He said like, get this guy to shut up. We don't need this. So his instincts in a lot of ways are a lot like kind of better than like the rest of his party. And he goes into the election benefiting maybe from Kamala Harris being a black woman who's a liberal from California. And he's still seen as conservatives. He's seen as more conservative than he was in 2016, but he is seen as like people don't see him as ideological as they see Kamala Harris. And I can sort of see like the idea behind like saying that like running to the center, like maybe not the exact way that she did, maybe might have been something that she needed to do. But like I guess like some of the late breaking poll, but like they did like it like just wasn't effective. She just probably wasn't the person for the moment. And like I don't know if Tim Walz could have been it. I don't know if it could have been a Gretchen Whitmer. But I think somebody disconnected to the administration, able to code as moderate as Trump was able to code himself. That's I think to the extent Trump has any superpower, it is that he was first seen as more moderate than the rest of his party, despite not really holding any moderate positions. At like besides like I mean there is the stuff on trade, and he has always said he won't cut Medicare and Social Security.
Yeah. I mean I do think people on that point.
It's a white guy syndrome, right?
Well,
We're
yeah,
just moderate.
I also think
Bernie
even though he was literally the person who put the justices on the court to overturn Roe versus Wade, because he personally is such a whore, I don't think people were like really convinced that he would be the one to ban pornography and like get rid of abortion rights.
Yeah,
you know?
I mean, look, it's totally irrational, but it's true. There's this white guy syndrome where if you're a white guy, people just think like, oh, I gotta be moderate. Right?
Yeah,
like,
I mean,
that's just what it is.
So I mean, my analysis, you seem to really think my analysis is much different from yours, and it's really not. I think there's a some of the near-term problems we talked about with the Harris campaign where, you know, there are certain things I would have done differently, but I do think it's sort of unfair to lay all the blame at her feet because you've also got medium-term problems, which is the Democratic Party's decision not to have a democratic process and run a primary. And so you end up with this candidate at the last second, hobbled with all of the administration's issues and having not gone through a primary where, you know, even if she had been the candidate to emerge, which I don't think she would have been, but even if she had been, she would have been tested by that. She would have had an opportunity to separate herself from Joe Biden, explaining this is why I think I would be better as a candidate for president. So there's the medium-term issues, but I think the biggest issues are the longer-term ideological issues. You know, we've been since Jimmy Carter sort of starts to dip his toe in the waters of neoliberalism. Reagan embraces it wholeheartedly. Clinton decides to capitulate to it, and that sort of cements this neoliberal era that we've been in for some time, you know, in a break from the New Deal era, which was also a bipartisan affair since FDR. And after the financial collapse in particular, effectively the neoliberal era was kind of dead, like exposed as unpopular, as a failure on both, you know, like moral and basic economic grounds. This idea that like, oh, we'll ship your jobs overseas, but GDP growth will be a little bit higher, so it'll all be fine. Like this all kind of comes crashing down. And there were two alternative grassroots movements that rose up in response to that crash. One is on the right. It's the Tea Party. It's very xenophobic. It leads to birtherism. That gives rise to Trump. And, we see where that goes. And Trumpism is able to take over the Republican Party and offer, as Kyle described, this, wrong, bad, evil, but clear-cut narrative about what has gone wrong. And on the left, of course, it was Occupy, pointing the finger at the 1%. And then directly out of Occupy is the Bernie Sanders grassroots movement. Bernie names the millionaires and billionaires, like they're the culprits. There's a clear narrative about what has gone wrong, who the villains are, right? Unfettered capitalism and the, economic royalists, et cetera. There's an authenticity to it. There's policy prescriptions attached to it. And over the past roughly decade, the Democratic Party's primary project has not actually been to defeat Donald Trump. It has been to defeat that movement, the left populist, class-first left populist movement, as embodied by Bernie Sanders and, others who are sort of in that orbit. And they succeeded. Yeah. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't, adopt some of like the antitrust and the labor stuff in the Biden administration, all good, but also not improving anyone's life like right now in the here and now. And critically also, it is not attached to an alternative vision with villains and heroes and protagonists and a set of policy prescriptions. It's not a coherent worldview. And so, ultimately they're left still clinging to this hollowed out husk of neoliberalism, and it fails. And so, one of the things I found really noteworthy is the very demographics that are now most rapidly fleeing the Democratic Party. We're talking about Latinos, working class, bros. Those were Bernie Sanders. Like, that's where he had specific, unique strength. And part of why I'm very depressed and not very hopeful right now is because those people who could have formed the grassroots soldiers for an alternative left populist vision, they're gone. It's over. They did it. You killed the movement. Congratulations. And now this is where we're left. So I suspect, even though now you have people like David Brooks who are like, gee, maybe Bernie was right. Yeah. I suspect the lesson that they'll learn is what we need to do is, embrace kinder, gentler fascism. They're already doing it. We'll be like Trump on the border. You cede, you accept that worldview. And you say, we're going to do the same mass deportation camps, but we're not going to call immigrants garbage or whatever. And that's the direction they take the party in. Very, very similar and analogous to what Bill Clinton did in the 90s by triangulating with neoliberalism. And again, I'm not saying it's not an effective electoral strategy. I think they can win some elections that way, especially once Trump is gone.
That's crazy.
Once Trump is gone, because, he is this kind of uniquely charismatic figure, and J.D. Vance doesn't hold a candle to him in that regard. But in terms of having a party that is, remotely reflective of our values, I'm very concerned that ship has just basically sailed.
So let me just say, in some ways, I'm more doomer-pilled, but also in some ways, I'm less doomer-pilled. So I think that if Bernie was hypothetically 65 years old, we snapped our fingers and he was 65 years old, and he was the candidate this time around, and he ran against Trump.
Yeah.
My contention is, I don't think Bernie would have won that. That's my contention. So I think, because
why?
I'll tell you why. Because Democrats incorporated some of Bernie's ideas under the Biden administration, and we gave Biden a lot of credit for those particular economic ideas. But there was just, I read this article this morning, 80% of voters in a blind policy test said they preferred Kamala Harris's policies to Trump's policies. So when you don't tell them who it is and you give them the policies, 80% say, we like Kamala's. So my takeaway from that is, it's not about policy. It's just not. I want to take.
Hold on. You pinpointed it, though. You're right. It's not just about policy. Here's my checklist. It's about having a narrative and a story with villains and protagonists that make sense to people. And that's what is fundamentally lacking. And, there has been the left version of what could come after neoliberalism was crushed. And so I think liberals did more, actually, than the right in helping, crush the one movement that there's no guarantees, that at least had a shot ideologically to compete with Trumpism.
So, but I would just say that, to me, the operative factor that nobody else is talking about but me is that what I want is Bernie's policies. Yes, I think that helps electorally, but I'm saying it's not necessarily determinative. But I want Bernie's policies but it has to be in the package of a controversial, charismatic celebrity for our fucking idiot American brains that have been poisoned by social media and having a nanosecond attention span.
Yeah.
Like, that's such an important part, and nobody's talking about that part. Because if Tim Walz was at the top of the ticket, I think he would have lost.
I don't think it's that. I mean, I just don't think it's that revelatory that like politicians need to be charismatic and effective.
But Democrats never are.
But Bernie is. I don't want to get caught up on like the specific person of Bernie Sanders because that's not really my point. Although I do think he has some of the qualities that you're talking about.
Some, yeah.
My contention is that, you know, yes, you need the charismatic whatever figure to be able to articulate the vision. Otherwise, it just sort of like falls flat. But the core, like the root problem for Democrats is that they continue to cling to a broken and discarded ideology long past its expiration date and have systematically crushed the popular alternative to it that was manifestly appealing to the very demographic groups that they are now like repellent to.
Our only disagreement is I would say they're incorporating it a little more than we're giving them credit for. That's what I would say.
But let me, sorry, and then Josh, I'll get you in there. Sorry.
So we invited you on and me and her just arguing the whole time.
I have a synthesis for what you guys are saying.
Go ahead.
Let's do it,
Yeah, so basically, Crystal, I completely agree with you that they didn't. Oh, I agree with you that you need a compelling story, but I disagree that they didn't have a story. They did. If you listen, like nobody really, if you like followed what the people who made up the top positions of the Biden administration were saying, they did have a narrative for what their whole project was that encompassed everything that they did, including the left-wing, like more populistic policies that we talked about. It was called, in the words of Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, a foreign policy for the middle class. And the conception here, and this is what the Biden administration saw their purpose was, is that they saw the fundamental struggle, the story in the world right now, as not like a story, like a struggle between like the rich or like the poor, or the like immigrants or citizens, or the woke versus the non-woke. It was democracy versus authoritarianism. They saw everything within the light of this kind of neocon conception of the world that has been part of Biden's own, like it's been central to how Biden understands the world throughout his entire career, from when he was like close friends with Scoop Jackson, who was like kind of the godfather of the neoconservative movement, to when he was very supportive of Israel in the 80s, to when he supported like interventions like in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, when he backed the Iraq War as the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in 2003, 2002, up to like the present moment, throughout the Obama administration. His entire they understand Trumpism as part of this global wave of like kind of anti-democratic liberal movements, and they see their role as defending like democracies overseas and defending democratic systems, and they want to prove to Americans that this larger global interventionist project, which they know has been discredited since the Iraq War, can still work, that it can work for them. So when they advertise things like Build Back Better, they advertise things like these big spending policies that we all like. Part of it is advertised as we're making a fairer, better economy, but a lot of it was advertised in that this helps us with competition with China. This helps us with competition with our adversaries overseas. The CHIPS Act was advertised as a way to get a competitive advantage over China with chips. All the climate bills were advertised as a way to get a competitive advantage with China in climate. It wasn't really like put together as like there were like the Bidenomics thing was that like he was making a break from Reaganomics, but the larger kind of conception of what the purpose of this administration is so they can perpetuate this idea of America as a global hegemon.
Yeah, that's such a great point.
Yeah, I didn't consider it like that.
That is actually such a great point.
That makes perfect sense. So they need to change the conception from that to basically class war, to say it's not the immigrants holding you back, it's the fucking billionaires and the CEOs and the donor class.
Practically anything else other than like trying. They put all their efforts, all their eggs in trying to resuscitate the corpse of a neoconservative global interventionist ideology, not because it was popular, not because it was even going to be successful, because it's what they personally agreed with and thought was important. They did what they accuse leftists of doing, where they say leftists are like they're being like so irresponsible and idealistic. They're throwing everybody under the bus in the name of these like fringe ideologies. That was what they oriented their entire administration around. So when you got moments where, like after the initial invasion of Ukraine, like when there was public support for helping them, and there was a bipartisan consensus around sending money there, they saw this as a huge vindication because all of Biden's administration was never staffed with the kinds of people that Obama staffed his later administration with, who people like Ben Rhodes or arguably even John Kerry, who might have had dovish streaks. It was all people who had been with Biden when he was foreign relations chair, Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and they saw themselves on the side of what has been described as the blob. And they thought this has been described in books written about his foreign policy team, that this was going to be the moment where they got public support back. And they,
oh my God.
Literally 4%, guys.
Delusional.
In the exit polls, 4% of voters described foreign policy as their top
Imagine
issue.
being that delusional.
4%.
Yeah.
And by the way, also, democracy versus authoritarianism, it's not that that's not a legitimate debate to have. The problem is that the U.S. often backs authoritarian regimes. We back Israel, we back Saudi Arabia. It's just bullshit. Basically what it means is us and our allies are good, us and our friends are good, and anybody who's not on the same page as multinational U.S. corporations are evil. That's what it boils down to. So it's a framework that's not even applied correctly.
Yeah. And
it's moralistic, inconsistently moralistic, and moralistic in the sense that Biden often, when he talked about this, he would describe the alliances as sacred, literally using religious fucking overtones to talk about things like NATO.
That's
He talked about our moral commitment to these democracies.
The AUKUS voters, they didn't save this election. That's crazy.
That's all such a great point.
So you get to a point throughout his administration where they're it's not even everything is downstream to enabling this overseas intervention. Everything is downstream of keeping an indefinite commitment to Ukraine, keeping an indefinite commitment to Israel, sending tens of billions of dollars to these countries overseas while people feel like they're falling behind economically. And their only response to this, and this is part of the foreign policy of the middle class, these breathtakingly cynical campaigns where they talk about how much money the missile factories are creating jobs in Arizona and Pennsylvania. That's their vision. That's their vision.
I think you did
that's true.
Successfully bridge the gap between Crystal and I, because that all makes sense to me. I guess to sum up my position, what I would say is the way out of this mess is not just to rebuild the Bernie movement. The way out of it is to rebuild the Bernie movement with more bells and whistles and teeth and led by a charismatic, controversial celebrity. But if we don't do that second part of it, if it's some boring asshole who's trying to lead the next Bernie movement, they will fail. People will pick an entertaining fascist over somebody who's great on all the issues but boring. Yeah. It just will.
Yeah.
And I just, I'm just more sort of doomerish because I just don't even feel like there's the vestiges, the remnants of the left to remain, to even if you do have a charismatic leader.
We didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, they did.
They're still there.
They went to Elon Musk and Joe Rogan.
Some of them.
And many of them.
You kind of just have to hope for them to flop and these low attention spans to constantly be these guys suck. They're the establishment now. I want something new.
Yeah.
Listen, Trump will, I guarantee you, hear me now, quote me later, there will come a time in this administration where Trump becomes either equally as unpopular as he was on January 7th, the day after January 6th, or he will go even lower than that, because now he's unchained. Now he has Supreme Court immunity. Now he's surrounding himself with loyalists. Every single visceral gut instinct of dumbass shit he wants to do, he will do, and people will report on it, and it'll go down and down and down and down and down. So the idea that it's over is not true. In fact, the thing we really have to fear, guys, is that he does so bad and so horrible that literally any slop Democrat gets put in front of us and wins in a landslide in the next election. That's what I fear, is that it's right back to neoliberalism with some asshole.
That's my point.
Right,
it's not that I don't think Democrats can win again. Oh, I think they're likely to do well in the midterms.
It's that they'll move further right and
I think that they'll
have
have a good shot the next presidential cycle, especially Trump himself will be out, and all of the lackeys that will follow behind are much less talented than he is. It's the ideological battle that I'm concerned about, because, you already see the commentary of basically we need to move further right on immigration, further right on crime. It's the left's fault and all this wokeism, which really pisses me off, because we know that it was Hillary Clinton who started with the, Bernie's racist and sexist and breaking up the big banks is not going to end racism. They're the ones that inserted that type of language and identity representation, surface level identity politics into the National Progressive Dialogue. But that's where most people, even though you do have some like, oh, maybe Bernie was right, that's where the bulk of the analysis is going. And not only that, they've already moved in this direction. You know,
Yes.
they've already capitulated. Like the immigration thing, Kyle and I had a disagreement on this too.
Yeah, you were right about it. You were right about it.
They just accepted the Republican frame that immigrants are bad, period, full stop. And we need to stop them and we need to deport them and fuck the pathway to citizenship. We just need to be border hawks. And guess what?
They did it and it didn't work.
Right. And when you have both major parties with the same message that immigrants are bad, guess what? A majority of the public is going to go, oh, I guess immigrants are bad. They're doing the same thing already on crime. You know, forget about criminal justice reform. Like, that's never even possibility on the table.
Trump did it, First Step Act.
Gavin Newsom is out there, you know, personally raising homeless encampments and aggressively positioning himself as tough on crime. It's like a return to some 90s Clinton era bullshit. So that's, to me, most likely the direction. John Fetterman is now taking like a star turn. Everyone wants to fucking interview John Fetterman about how do we save the Democratic Party.
Chuck Todd wants to interview him. But I have, you're right, but I've also seen more clips than I would have expected on MSNBC and CNN where, yeah, a lot of people are saying what you're saying, but then there's a lot of people you wouldn't expect who were like, yeah, maybe Bernie was right. David Brooks said it. Somebody else on MSNBC
I know that,
said
but
it.
I just don't think there's enough remaining from the ashes of the Bernie movement that they systematically destroyed to be able to like restart. I hope I'm wrong, but you know, to me, it is much more likely that they just continue down the pathway. I mean, look at their policy vis-a-vis Israel. Like, nothing is too immoral or horrific or fascistic for this party to embrace. And so I think what we're very likely to see is kinder, gentler fascism from the Democrats. And yes, it could be electorally successful. I'm not saying it won't be, but it will not reflect, you know, any sort of ideology that I want to involve myself with.
Yeah, it probably won't be able to sustain itself.
We need a mold breaker, right? All right, guys, this is just a little piece of the longer interview we did with Edinger Mentum where we talked about what went wrong for Democrats in the Kamala Harris campaign where Trump won. So we get into all of it. Hope you guys sign up on Substack below and enjoy the full thing.